Hey guys, welcome to our online version of our Wednesday night Bible study, or whatever time you happen to be watching this. Remember that we're doing this mainly because we can't meet publicly due to all of the coronavirus stuff that's going on around our city, around our state, around our country, around the world. And so hopefully that what we're doing now is a proactive approach to helping contain the spread of the virus, and that we'll be able to return to kind of our normal way of doing things in the very near future. And so, as you can see, we're going to be talking about whether or not the New Testament is true. If you haven't been following along with us over the last couple of months, then allow me to kind of give you a quick recap of what we've been discussing. Tonight we're going to be discussing a more specific part of this question, and that is, did the New Testament authors tell us the truth? Okay, but as a way of recap, we over the past couple of months, we have asked the following questions. Does truth exist? And we've answered yes. In order to claim that truth does not exist, you have to borrow from the existence of truth in order to deny it. And so it's a self-defeating claim. When we also then asked, does God exist? Right, and so we've asked that question, and we've answered the question as yes, as evidenced by the following things: the beginning of the universe. Right, if the universe had a beginning, then something or someone had to begin it or start it. Right, we look at the universe and we see the design of it, how it seems to be very intricately balanced. And we call that fine-tuning, right? And so various aspects of the universe seem to be just right in order for life to exist at all. Not even just human life, but any kind of life. And so when we look at those things and we look at that data, we kind of conclude, okay, there looks like something or someone might have put it that way. It seems more likely that that's the case than that it occurred, I guess, over time. That chaos somehow organized itself into very, 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 very strict order. We also see this kind of in the design of life as we look into our own selves, or into life. As we look inside the cell, for example, the cell is a very, very complicated machine. And then when you look even further, you look at DNA and you look at the vastness and the complexity of what DNA is. And this leads us to believe that it may have been done that way by somebody or something outside of the universe. And then we talked about the moral law, and so we talked about the existence of moral absolutes that everybody understands or instinctively knows, that there are certain things that are right to do and certain things that are wrong to do. One of the classic examples of that, though, is murder. Just about every society on the planet believes that murdering other human beings is wrong, even though they sometimes practice in that. We understand that we should not kill another human being or murder another human being. And so we have to ask why we instinctively know those things. And so while we don't have time to kind of go over all of those things again, we look at that and say that it looks like that something or someone outside of space, time, and matter began the universe, designed it in a specific fashion, and then designed life in a very specific form, but then also gave us a very specific moral law, and that applies to everybody. So we said, yes, God exists. Then we asked the question, are miracles possible? Well, and that's pretty obvious if God exists. If God exists, then miracles are possible. God created the universe. He can do whatever he wants with it. And so anytime that he interrupts what is the normal process of things, then we call that a miracle. That's the basic, simple definition. But yes, miracles are possible if God exists. And so then we moved on to the New Testament and talking about whether or not the New Testament is true. And so we asked that in really two big questions. First, do we have an accurate copy of the original New Testament documents? And then secondly, did the New Testament authors tell the truth? Which that question is kind of the subject of today and the next couple of lessons that we're going to do. Do we have an accurate copy of the New Testament documents? I believe that the answer is yes, based on manuscript evidence. We have thousands of manuscripts of all kinds of different parts of the New Testament and the Old Testament. And these thousands of copies ultimately get compared to one another and then kind of use that to reconstruct the originals. And so it's a very, very technical and very, very lengthy process. But I think I can say with beyond reasonable doubt that what we have in our Bibles today is an accurate copy of what the original New Testament document said. Now, just because that it might be accurate doesn't necessarily make it true, which is why we're asking the question, do New Testament authors tell us the truth? Either they told us the truth or they lied, right? It's entirely possible to have an accurate copy of something that was completely made up. The question is, which one does the evidence point to? And so we're going to talk about that right here. And so right now, I want to give you kind of the roadmap of the next few weeks. All right, and so we're going to talk about 6 reasons for believing the New Testament authors told us the truth. Number 1, early testimony. And number 2, eyewitness testimony. We're going to be talking probably about those 2 things tonight. Embarrassing testimony, excruciating testimony, expected testimony, and extra-biblical testimony. You might be asking, what in the world do all those things mean? Well, you'll have to tune in over the next few weeks to find out. But for now, we're probably going to talk about the early and eyewitness testimonies. Okay? So what do we mean by early testimonies? All right, we're going to ask the question, were the New Testament documents written early? And the idea behind that is most scholars will date the crucifixion of Christ in the early 30s AD. So some may say 30, some may say 35, some may say 33. It's somewhere in the early 30s. And you would think that the closer a document is written describing those events is to that event, then the more likely it is that it's going to be accurate. All right. So the closer a writing is to the events that it describes, the more likely it is accurate. So I'm thinking about just if you were going to write about yourself or write about somebody else's life or something like that, usually the closer you write to the time of that event, the more accurate details you're going to have. And so if I'm at 35 years old, am I going to sit down and write about, my kindergarten experience? It's going to be very difficult. I'm 30 years removed from it, and a lot of life has happened, and it's tough to try to figure out. And we don't live in a world where we rely on memory of things as much, since we have all of these digital things that help us remember the things we want to remember, right? Photographs, videos, that sort of stuff. So for the ancient world, it was worked a little bit differently. You could probably recall events a little bit better, even though it might have been 10, 20, maybe 30 years, because you have to rely on that memory, right? There are no video recordings, there are no pictures, there are none of that show us what happened in the first century. And so if somebody writes about an event, the sooner that they write, the more accurate that account probably is going to be. So we look at the New Testament, and just about every New Testament document is considered to be written by an eyewitness, right? Somebody who saw the event. If it wasn't written by an eyewitness, then it was also written by somebody who was very close to an eyewitness, right? So they had a direct relationship probably to the person who gave them the information in which they wrote. All right, so the examples of that would be Mark and Luke and the book of Acts. Luke and Acts were written by the same person, but Mark was not an eyewitness of the events that he writes about. A lot of people argue that he got his information from Peter, who was an eyewitness, and then you have Luke, who got his information from Paul and other people who were considered eyewitnesses to the things that they're writing about. And so that's the case for every New Testament document. And then we have that numerous scholars believe that most, if not all, of the New Testament documents were written by AD 70. And you can see on the screen some of the reasons why we believe that. So one of the big ones is that the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. It's a very, very well-documented historical fact. This event took place. And so what happened was in the first century, the Jews living in Israel were occupied by Rome, right? Rome was in charge, and Rome would kind of allow the Jews to do what they wanted in terms of religion and things like that, as long as they were obedient to Roman law. And so there was a group of Jews who kind of got sick of Roman rule, and they wanted to get rid of them, and so they started kind of a riot, and they started a revolt, and so in 70 A.D. the Romans came in and they completely destroyed the temple, which is an event that Jesus predicted, but none of the New Testament writers mention it. None of them mention that it's taken place. Now, it would seem that Jewish writers speaking to Jewish audiences might want to include one of the biggest cataclysmic events of their history. All right, and so the destruction of Jerusalem's temple was an extremely big deal, right? That was the whole center of Jewish worship. And so the New Testament writers actually seem to talk of Jerusalem and the temple as if it's still intact. Right? If the temple was already destroyed, you would think that it would talk about it in that sense. All right. So believers and critics also agree that 1 Corinthians was written in the mid-50s AD. All right. So if it's written in the mid-50s, so 55 AD, that's roughly 20 years after Jesus was crucified. But the book of 1 Corinthians addresses some of the issues or some of the events that are taking place in the book of Acts, which is what Luke is writing. Luke is a companion of Paul, and so Paul is writing about these events. Luke is writing about the events in the book of Acts, and so you have an eyewitness writing about events that kind of correlate with what his friend is writing about. And so here's the thing: if you go back. If you want to hit the pause button and turn to Acts, or not Acts, but 1 Corinthians 15, go ahead and do it. But 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 to 8, okay, some suggest that this is kind of the form of an ancient creed, and creeds were used for kind of memory devices and memorizing stories and doctrines and things like that. And so if you haven't found a Bible or something, go hit the pause button, go Google it, whatever you need to do. 1 Corinthians 15, starting in chapter 3. All right? You got it? He says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of who remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also." So in this passage, okay, he names 14 eyewitnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. All right, Cephas is another name for Peter. The 12 apostles. All right, he's one of the 12. James, the brother of Jesus, and then Paul himself. So these 14 men are all claiming as witnesses to the event of the resurrection. All right. What else is interesting in this is that Paul references also an appearance to more than 500 other people. And so what this kind of points to is everybody seems to agree that this letter was written in the mid-50s AD, right? So it's very, very soon-ish after the Christ's crucifixion. Now here's kind of what I'm getting at, which we're going to talk about in a second, but I want you to notice one thing real quick. 20 years is not a very long time in the grand scheme of things. I know it might seem like forever for you, but 20 years really in the grand scheme of things is not a very long time at all. So assuming that the apostles were maybe in their 20s, maybe 30s at the time that Christ was crucified, right? Let's just assume they were young adult men. All right. By the time that this is being written, they're probably in their 50s or so, right? Maybe 60s. Okay, and so these eyewitnesses are still have this capability of recalling these major events that took place in their life, right? I can recall some of the major events that took place in my life, even though some of them took place 15 years ago, right? I just know because they were that significant. So the good news is that there's a relatively short amount of time between when the incident took place and when this stuff is being recorded. All right, and so we have this early testimony, and really this is just kind of a surface level kind of or sky view look of the data that we have for something like this. All right, but we also talk about eyewitness testimony, right? Were these people really eyewitnesses? He's identified these people. Did they really see it? And so, first of all, the New Testament writers were very confident in the verifiability of their testimony, right? They were very confident that they could prove what they were saying. All right, Paul is doing that in his letters all of the time. He does that in the book of Acts, which we're going to get to in a second. But Paul's reference to Jesus appearing over 500 people suggests that skeptics could go and ask those who saw it, right? If you look in verse 6 of 1 Corinthians 15, it says, "After that he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep." Right? Most of whom remain until now means, look, if you don't want to take my word for it, go ask them. Right? You can go back to the source and you can ask them what they saw and ask them for their testimony. And so, it's kind of like, you're talking about a story and you're saying, hey, so-and-so was there too. He saw it. Go talk to them and they'll tell you exactly what I'm telling you. All right. They'll prove it. Paul was not worried about somebody being able to verify what he was saying. In Acts 26, Paul claims that Herod Agrippa is the witness to the events that he describes. And so if you jump over to Acts chapter 26, go ahead and do it. Hit the pause button. All right, I'm going to challenge you to do something with all this extra time you got on your hands this week. All right, you ready? Go to Acts chapter 26, pause the video, and go and read the entire chapter. All right, it won't take you but a few minutes, but read it carefully. Okay? Paul is recounting all of these things that have happened to him, and some of the things that have happened surrounding those events. And so I want you to look specifically, though, in verse 24. It says, while Paul was saying this in his defense, Festus said in a loud voice, "Paul, you are out of your mind." Festus is a Roman official. He says, your great learning is driving you mad." But Paul said, "I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I utter words of sober truth. For the king knows about these matters, and I speak to him also with confidence, since I am persuaded that none of these things escape his notice, for this has not been done in a corner." And so what Paul is pointing out here is that King Agrippa is very familiar with these events. He's not necessarily doubting that these events have occurred or have taken place. What he is doubting is the truthfulness of who Jesus claims to be. But he says these things have not been done in a corner, right? These things have not been done in secret. Everybody has seen all these things. People witnessed that Jesus dying on the cross. All right, we have evidence for that. And so Paul is not worried in the least about whether or not his claims can be verified. The question is whether or not people are going to believe it, which is a different discussion altogether. Okay, so we talk about what Paul's ability to defend all of this stuff. All right, we also have archaeology and ancient writings and other means of investigation that have verified that the second half of the book of Acts contains 84 confirmed eyewitness details. All right, so the last half of the book of Acts, very, very detailed in the people that it talks about, the geographical locations that it mentions, all of these things. 84 of them are confirmed eyewitness details. All right, we have archaeological evidence. We have evidence from ancient writings outside the Bible, which we're going to get to at another time, and other means of investigation. We'll talk about those things as time comes up. All right, but I want you to understand we can't go through 84 of them in one video because it'll take forever. But if you want to know what 84 of them are, then I recommend going to a book. I'll tell you about that book in a minute. But now, 84 of them. All right, now go back to the book of Luke. Luke is the same writer as the book of Acts. You have it on your screen. Look at this screen for a moment. Pause it if you need to. Read it. Now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, and Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip was tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, And Lysanias was tetrarch of Abilene in the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. The word of God came to John, the son of Zacharias, in the woodlands, or in the wilderness. What is he trying to say? That the word of God came to John, the son of Zacharias, in the wilderness. That's ultimately what he's trying to say. But everything before that is a bullseye into identifying a very specific time in which it happened. Now, I'm going to save you a little bit of trouble. There are 8 people mentioned in 2 verses. Every single one of them has been historically verified to exist at the exact same time. Every one of them. Which is astonishing. This leads us to understand that Luke has done his homework as a historian and is giving us an accurate account of what has taken place. All right? But that's not the end. All right? If you want more details, I encourage you to pick up this book. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. All right? A lot of this material is coming from that book anyway. But if you want to see how they in their book, I think it's chapter 10 or chapter 11, they list all 84 of those details from the book of Acts. All right? But it's not just the book of Acts. Okay, are they really eyewitnesses? The Gospel of John has 59 historically reliable or historically probable details in it. All right, they also mention all 59 of them in that book. Okay, it's a big book. It's a lot to take in, and that one kind of throws you into the deep end of all of this stuff that we're kind of talking about more on the surface level. Okay. But if you're interested in it, I encourage you to go and buy that book, all right, because it's going to give you all of this stuff in a lot greater detail than we have time to go into. Over 30 figures are named in the New Testament who have been cited by non-Christian writers or confirmed through archaeology. All right, so archaeological evidence lends support to the truthfulness of the New Testament. All right. Also, non-Christian writers, ancient writers who have talked about these figures who existed in this time period. All right. And so it's not all about just kind of creating this story and fabricating a story. It's much, much bigger than that. We have this support that suggests that what we're reading in the New Testament actually took place. The question really is whether or not we believe it. All right. And so just kind of to recap real quick, and then you're free to go back to watching Netflix, Hulu, or Disney Plus, or whatever you're doing. It says most, if not all, of the New Testament documents were written within 40 years of the crucifixion of Christ. Right? If he was crucified in 30 A.D., most of these documents were written by 70 A.D. All right. The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem was such a massive event. One would think that if it had already happened, the authors would have mentioned it. There's no mention of it anywhere in the New Testament. The destruction of the temple is a well-documented historical fact, and it has not been rebuilt ever since. All right. When that event took place, the Jews left Israel. All right. They were kind of thrown out of their land, and they never returned to that land in any official capacity until 1948. Okay, 1948 was the year that Israel reoccupied at least a portion of the land that they had way back in AD 70. All right, and to this day, there is no Jewish temple. It has never been rebuilt. However, there's a prophecy that suggests that it will be rebuilt. And so we'll get to that in another time. All right. So the writers claim to be eyewitnesses, or they received their information from eyewitnesses. All right. So most of the gospel writers, or not the gospel writers, but the New Testament writers, are people who witness the events that they write about. With very few exceptions, they're all eyewitnesses. There's a few who received their information from eyewitnesses, but they had a direct relationship to the person who was an eyewitness. So Luke had Paul, Mark had Peter. All right, and so so eyewitness testimony is very, very important. It's also very valid, I think. So archaeological evidence and evidence from other ancient writings point to the validity of what the authors claimed. And so as we encounter the New Testament, we can begin to assure ourselves that what we're reading was real history. All right, it's not something that was fabricated. It was not something that was done in a corner, as Paul said. What we have is eyewitness testimony written very early after the events had taken place. All right, but this is not it. Okay, so next week what we're going to talk about is the next two things on our list here. We're going to talk about embarrassing and excruciating testimony. Those things are very, very fun because we're going to talk about how they were writing and what they included, and talk about whether or not they should have included that if they were lying. So until then, we'll see you next time, whether it's in person or online. I say God bless. Remember to take the opportunity this week and the next week, and as things progress, that you have a little bit more time in your life. Don't fill it with just stuff. Investigate these things. Invest in your relationship with the Lord. If there's any way that we can help you in that, let me know. Leave some stuff in the comments. Call me, text me. You know how to reach me. Until next week, we'll see you later. God bless.